When you think of the FBI, you're thinking of the most powerful police force the world has ever known. For over a century, it's hunted down threats, infiltrated groups, and erased enemies, both real and sometimes imagined. And the architect of it all? One man who understood power better than any president he ever served, J. Edgar Hoover. This is the story of how a nameless, powerless little bureau became a true shadow state. So to really get a grip on the FBI today, we've got to go back, way back, to its origins. Because it didn't start out as this powerhouse. Far from it. It began as this weak, overlooked agency that nobody took seriously, but an act of war, right on American soil, was about to forge it into a weapon and change the country forever. For 3 long years, Europe was just burning. The Great War was devouring an entire generation in the muddy trenches of France, while America watched from the safety of the sidelines. But that feeling of safety? Well, it was an illusion, and it was about to be completely shattered. By April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson would realize he had no choice but to lead the nation right into that fire. Now, at this time, the Bureau of Investigation was in a really pitiful state. It had been created back in 1908, but it was just this tiny, nameless little agency tucked away in the Justice Department. Think about this. Just 34 agents. No badges, no guns. They were laughed at by local police and totally ignored by Congress. For all intents and purposes, it was a joke. And then came the night that changed everything. It was just after midnight, July 30th, 1916. Black Tom Island, this massive munitions depot in New York Harbor, just starts to burn. Turns out, German saboteurs had spent months smuggling time bombs into a staggering 700,000 tons of explosives that were all headed for the war in Europe. The fuse was lit. The first blast just ripped the night open. We're talking 2,000 tons of TNT detonating in a chain reaction that must have felt like the end of the world. The shockwave was so immense it shattered windows 40 miles away in New Jersey. People felt it as far south as Philadelphia. It even threw so much steel shrapnel that it scarred the Statue of Liberty. And for a lot of Americans, this was the psychological turning point. When they opened their newspapers the next day and saw their most cherished symbol of freedom physically damaged by an enemy attack, suddenly the war wasn't some distant headline anymore. The fear was real. It was visceral. All of a sudden, every German neighbor started to look like a potential enemy hiding in their midst. The transformation was incredibly swift and profound. Practically overnight, President Wilson gives the Justice Department these emergency war powers to arrest any alien they deemed dangerous. No questions asked, no trial necessary. And that little bureau, it suddenly had everything it never had before: money, men, and a crystal clear mission. It was reborn as the Alien Enemy Bureau, and its new job was to track down and jail thousands of Germans living in America. And right in the middle of all this wartime chaos, a door opens in Washington. A young man, just 22 years old, ruthless, hungry for power, steps across the threshold of the Justice Department. His name was John Edgar Hoover, and with his arrival, the age of American secret intelligence had just begun. Now, Hoover wasn't just any ambitious clerk. He was the product of this intense discipline. A small kid, talked really fast, stuttered when he got nervous, but on the debate stage, he was an ice-cold, unstoppable force. He absolutely hated losing. At night, he worked at the Library of Congress, and there he mastered its complex classification system. He learned that any fact, any piece of information could be found if he just knew how to file it and how to retrieve it. Okay, so the war with Germany ends. You'd think everyone would breathe a sigh of relief, right? Wrong. A new fear immediately rushes in to take its place. Over in Russia, Lenin seizes power and the Soviet Union is born. To millions of exhausted, poor people around the world, this looks like the future. But in America, it looks like a plague. The country just watches and it trembles. The year 1919 was pure, unadulterated chaos. Soldiers came home from the war to find there were no jobs. Massive strikes by steelworkers, coal miners, even the police just paralyzed the nation. Race riots burned through 25 different cities. And then the bombs started going off in 8 cities, all at once. It really felt like the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't just coming to America, it was already here. And for Hoover, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He's just 24 years old when he's handed control of a brand new radical division. And what was his raw material? A staggering 200,000 index cards, each one a file on a person suspected of being a subversive. He was given unlimited overtime, a direct line to the Attorney General. He had found his calling. And what he did with that power, was terrifying. Hoover masterminded what became known as the Palmer Raids. Federal agents just smashed into homes at midnight, no warrants, dragging thousands of people out into the street. Hundreds were thrown onto this freezing ship, nicknamed the Soviet Ark, and deported to Russia without ever seeing a trial. Hoover personally wrote the orders, keeping perfect, meticulous files on every single name. He called it justice. His critics called it terror. The Red Scare eventually faded, but the peace didn't last long. The Great Depression was about to plunge the nation into a whole new kind of despair, giving rise to a new kind of enemy, one who carried a machine gun instead of a manifesto. This was the era that would forge the legend of the G-Man. In October of 1929, Wall Street crashed, and billions of dollars just vanished into thin air. By 1933, 1 in every 4 Americans was out of work. You had breadlines stretching for blocks in what was supposed to be the richest country on earth. And in that crucible of despair, where hope is the very first thing to die, a new kind of folk hero was born: the outlaw. I mean, look at these names. Pretty Boy Floyd robbed banks and then gave the money to starving farmers. Babyface Nelson would spray streets with machine gun fire and just laugh about it. Ma Barker and her boys carved this bloody trail right across the Midwest. The country was suddenly at war with its own desperados. And then John Dillinger stepped onto the stage. He was this cocky farm boy from Indiana who made robbing banks look less like a crime and more like an art form. He escaped from jail twice, once with a fake gun he carved out of wood. He would taunt sheriffs by sending them postcards. Crowds actually cheered for him. The newsreels called him public enemy number 1, and you know what? Half the country secretly loved him for it. J. Edgar Hoover read every story, he clipped every single photo, and you can just imagine him feeling the heat rising. This charismatic outlaw was making a complete mockery of law enforcement, and Hoover took it very, very personally. He made a silent vow: Dillinger must fall. This was about to become the greatest manhunt in American history, and for his bureau it was a test of its very existence. And the manhunt itself really highlights the central conflict. On one side, you have Dillinger. He's basically untouchable. He'd just vanish across state lines where local police had no authority to follow. On the other side, you've got Hoover's agents, who at this point were still pretty powerless. They lacked the federal jurisdiction to pursue him effectively. They were always one step behind. So how did it all end? Not with some brilliant piece of detective work. Nope. It ended with betrayal. A woman named Anna Sage, an immigrant who was facing deportation, walked into a theater on Dillinger's arm. History would remember her as the woman in the red dress. She had sold out the devil himself for a chance to stay in America. The final scene played out like something straight out of a movie. As Dillinger stepped out of the Biograph Theater, 20 agents just rose from the shadows. His hand dove for his gun, but it was way too late. 5 shots cracked the night air, and public enemy number 1 crumpled to the pavement, dead at 31. Dillinger's death was the turning point. Hoover wasted absolutely no time, and the Bureau moved with brutal efficiency. It was like dominoes falling. Pretty Boy Floyd was dead by October, Babyface Nelson by November, and Machine Gun Kelly was in chains before Christmas. The message was loud and clear. The government was back in control. And just like that, the Bureau's transformation was complete. It went from being a joke that cops laughed at to a national legend. The age of the gangster was over. The age of the G-Man had begun. And J. Edgar Hoover, the man who hated chaos more than anything else, had just drawn first blood in a war for the soul of America, a war he would fight for the rest of his life.